Alright, as brief as possible, a video explaining a force unification theory I have developed. And it's really quite simple. It reduces everything to just a fundamental field of energy, and with just two or three axioms or principles, it creates all the phenomena known in the universe, in the sense that, like a checkerboard with a lot of checkers, patterns can be created out of the simplicity, and there's no real limitation to how big the patterns can get or how many checkers there can be on the board. So this video is for people who know physics terms, understand Maxwell's equations, let's say, and understand the mechanism of the convergence that is gravity, and aren't carrying some resistance to listening to arguments defending the idea that maybe a couple mistakes were made in the past in physics regarding establishing certain mechanisms as being the truth rather than useful models. So yes, to get past the prejudice, if you are aware of Lesage gravity, it's not that, but it's the idea of particle gravity, but it obviously carries with it features that make it much more powerful and therefore much more deserving of a fair trial. So anyway, let's start with the idea that push is simpler than pull. Pull is complicated. A simple mechanism, a simple system can't do pull. Only a complex system can do pull. So that is an underlying idea. You look for any movement in anything or any function as being a consequence of something forcing or pushing. Forcing is a key word here. So this is about unifying all the forces, and I would include all the photons as forces. They're small bits moving the speed of light. The gravity is small bits moving the speed of light. Magnetism is small bits moving the speed of light. And so this was the real problem with the current model, the standard model, is that bent space was used to explain the convergence that's gravity, and therefore that energy, that mechanism, doesn't have a life anymore. It ends, where it sort of can be understood that in all the other force dynamics, energy never stops. Whatever happens keeps happening forever. The force doesn't stop moving. The force is permanent and perpetual in a sense. In that sense, violating its own rules, but obviously it's not a violation if you're conserving the energy. And conservation in this case means perpetuation. So anyway, let's start with the basic idea that you have a field of energy. Now, to change Lesage models of this pressure, this automatic pressure created, so any one point in this field will feel pressure like as if everything's heading right for it. Everything that will hit it will seem like it's heading right for it. So it'll all be like light bulbs. So an infinite field of, a very large field of external pressure is exactly the same in terms of visualizing it as light bulbs. It's just light bulbs in reverse. So certainly you can understand how this creates the potential for the convergences that create movement. The difference in this theory is that these bits of field energy, they're all moving the speed of light, they're all identical, they all have the same value, except there's two kinds, two polarizations. Let's just call them, for the sake of convenience, red and black. So we've identified the two types. And then you can sort of understand that if they have complete kinetic reactions, let's say two of them are heading for each other and two reds hit each other head on, if there's no time involved in the interaction, you could sort of understand that hitting each other and missing each other create exactly the same universe. There's absolutely no difference. But the difference would be if one of them is black and one of them is red, and they reflect, then you see a difference in the universe. Because now black is going that way and red is going that way, where it was the inverse before the reaction. And the same is true for perpendicular reactions. They could be invisible as the universe sees them, or if they're perpendicular, you change the universe through the interaction. So all the interactions are like this, purely kinetic, at the speed of light. No wasted energy, no heat, no little bits fall off. So the ultra-mundane particles are indestructible particles having a quanta of the speed of light. They don't slow down, they don't speed up. They always keep going the speed of light, and all they do is change color. So this is the key reaction that's happening in the universe. Is something goes in and it leaves perpendicularly. Now it's perfectly consistent with the phenomena of magnetism and electricity. All the velocity of the fundamental particles in terms of the atomic particles is that you give them a momentum and they excrete energy, a force, perpendicularly. What's called EMF or some other field perturbation, but it's in fact an actual moving bit. All right. So you got the two types of energy, the red and the black. The simple property is moves the speed of light in straight lines, and that's it. And so it carries one momentum, one element of momentum, one quanta of momentum. Let's call it, and let's just call them quantons for the sake of argument. Now, in their natural state, they're just random, and they're not at a frequency. When they're in the form of light, they're at a specific frequency. That is, they're coming at specific frequencies, distances from each other. So they have a specific distance from each other. So light isn't a wave or two field mechanisms. It's just this quanta moving in the same vector at a frequency, like machine gun bullets, for example. And I would argue they're black. I'll get to that. And then magnetism would be these same elements, except the magnetic filters, which I'll get to very shortly, are separating them. So they're filtering them. So a magnet is just a filter. Gravity goes in, and the gravity is segregated. Red gravity comes out the top, black gravity comes out the bottom of the magnet. The north is south, however you want to distinguish it. And that's the function. So that's it for the forces, the main forces. The rest of the forces are all just a consequence of the fact that the elemental particles of the atom, the atomic bits, let's just say we have just electrons and protons for the sake of argument, are our main players. The charged particles are in fact just magnetic monopoles. If you had a magnetic monopole, it would act exactly like an electron or a proton. It would do exactly the same thing they do. So they are in fact just magnetic monopoles. And these two elements, like the red and black field energy, are a type of energy, a type of quanta that's just stuck together. So the quanta can't leave this circle. So we'll call it a circle. And we'll say this is an electron. It has bits in it that are pressurized, but they don't leave. There's a membrane. And a proton is the same thing, it's just red sensitive. So the key function here now, as you can understand, is that the black bits, when they hit an electron, will reflect. That's it. So a black bit hits the electron, it hits a piece of momentum in the electron, but it's a stuck piece, a piece that doesn't leave. But this is part of the reason why it doesn't leave, is this exact pressure that's being created by this reaction. But anyway, let's see, the black field energy hits and it just reflects. And it's basically doing the same thing inside the electron, creating a balance inside the electron, because the field energy in most circumstances equalized. Now, if two electrons are interacting with each other, whatever quanta are trapped between them, as the electrons are moved closer and closer, all that energy is trapped, therefore there's more and more interactions. So if you thought of the quanta as little ping pong balls, the little ping pong balls would have many more reactions, which means they're creating more effect because there's more interactions. Interactions are the key to having an energy effect. So you can have the same amount of quanta in a system, and just by moving two things closer together, you create more energy in that system, more interactions in that system, and therefore more pressure. And pressure is the key concept throughout this whole thing. It's just pressure. Everything is pushed, and the push just means there's a lack of pressure. So if there's more pressure behind me than in front of me, I get pushed forward. I'm never pulled anywhere. I'm always pushed, technically. So you can understand that, so the red in red and black in black, if it can get trapped in between, you can understand the pressure gets greater as the items are brought closer together, and there's always a strong pressure to keep them at a certain distance before that pressure is neutralized. Now, if red force hits an electron, this is the key perpendicular reaction. The red force essentially exchanges identity with a piece of energy inside of the electron. The electron gives away the red in the perpendicular. It keeps the momentum in the forward direction, and so essentially what it gains is it gains forward momentum. That means if it had 4 and 4 going forward and 4 going backward, it now has 5 going forward, and so now it has more impetus forward. At the same time, it gave away energy in this direction, which means now it has less arrows going this way, which means it has a tendency to move in this direction. That's why electrons tend to move in non-straight lines. Don't want to get into that too deeply. All right, now for so this explains your repulsive forces between electrons and protons and protons. It's the fact that energy is trapped. Now, the relief valve is when a proton and electron interact with each other, all the energy ends up escaping between them. All the black goes out perpendicularly from the red, all the red goes out perpendicularly from the black, so nothing can get trapped. Therefore, no energy can be maintained, barely any energy can be maintained between these two bodies. That means the external pressure is free to apply its momentum, and the bodies will end up being pushed towards each other. The only pressure that will get in is that energy coming in this way, red energy coming in this way, can get bent this way, reflect off the red, go back out, leave again, but there'll be some impacts, which means there'll be some pressure. So there's a minimum amount of pressure so the two things don't collide into each other. So this is the key function for the electron and the proton, and this is really powerful in terms of the nuclear forces. Slight modifications to this explain the strong nuclear force. Why two protons end up close together is that if you put an electron between two protons, all of the red energy will escape through the electron, and if you knock the electron out, the two protons will still have no red arrows between them and no real access to them because it's a straight line force. They can't just fill up, and so the two protons will tend to move very close to each other, in spite of the fact that we think of them as being incapable of doing that. We've just eliminated the energy that was actually creating the force that pushed them apart. Without the ping pong balls, there's no increase in frequency, there's no increase in reflections, therefore there's no increase in pressure. Alright, a key function in all this is once you realize that you can do this right turn, or left turn, or up turn, or down turn in the two dimensions, right? There's one dimension of your momentum, and then the two dimensions that are perpendicular to that. So there's 4 paths for the energy to take as a perpendicular path. There's 4 perpendicular paths. But anyway, so the idea of this right turn means if you just add up 4 right turns, you end up with a circle. And so that's the key to storage of force. So this is how all force is stored, is that it is trapped in mechanisms that create this opportunity for 4 turns of the same, 4 right turns. Could be any number of kind of turns, but you just end up with the idea of you have 4 extra right turns when you create a trap, or left turns, or any other kind of turn. But the idea is the idea of a trap being created, where the energy is perpetually moving and has no effect in terms of reaching out to the universe. It's just caught in this internal roadway, this internal circle. This affects velocity in the sense that with that trap, you can end up having that trap and just have more matter bits, that is electrons or protons, in the one path. So if this is all moving circularly this way, more matter is on the path moving this way than is on the path moving this way. Therefore, more momentum is achieved in this direction, and this thing would be said to have velocity because this matter keeps moving forward and there's no matter moving backward. So clearly it'll just circle its way through the future in a direction. And that's the nature of velocity. And that sort of eliminates the whole thermodynamic problem of Lesage gravity. And it also provides an opportunity to understand mechanisms like time dilation, in the sense that if you increase the amount of force, the activity going in this direction, you could understand that any other mechanism the atoms are involved in is going to be degraded. This is essentially multitasking. So it's like if I asked you to dance, and then I asked you to, as fast as you can, and then I said, well, move to your right. To move to your right, you're going to have to update a bunch of other pieces. You're going to have to move your feet that aren't dance steps, and those non-dance steps will take time. And that's essentially what takes place when matter has velocity, is that stuff that was updating in one way is now updating in another way. So it's another task, and to do the new task, it can't do the old tasks at the same speed. And that's essentially the function that creates muons that decay slower when they have high velocity. It's because the velocity is a force inside of the muon, and it's a task it has to accomplish, and that task is delaying how long it takes to do the other tasks. Or you could also see it as, because it has more energy, it's expanded a little bit, and now a circle that was this big is now a circle this big, and it takes longer to do a clock cycle on those bigger circles. So there's different ways it can be modeled, but the basic function is multitasking or increased task. The task speed is degraded because there's more to deal with. Alright, so that's not too bad. Yeah. So now to get to how this does magnetism, which is the huge benefit of it all. So you have the idea of that basic function of the relief valve. That is, all the red energy goes out the black thing, all the black energy goes out the red thing, and that eliminates all the pressure. And so magnets are basically these atomic structures. You know, this is already part of conventional physics, but the idea would be is the atoms establish a heaviness in a direction. So if you just thought of the monopoles being staggered in the proper way and aligned in the proper way, a magnet is basically something you could cut this magnet anywhere and it'll be exactly the same, because what it basically does is creates all red at the top and all black at the bottom, and no matter where force comes in here, so I could point an arrow in any direction, and really all you're looking for is what color is it when it goes out. So if it comes in a straight line, what color will it likely come out as? And through the whole bottom half of this magnet, the odds are it's going to be black, and through the whole top of this magnet, the odds are it's going to be red, and especially at the top. So if any energy comes in straight, it's inevitably going to come out all red here, whatever the last color is, the last line, so to speak, and come out black at the bottom. So it can be understood, the filter can be understood in those simple terms. The gravity comes in, so the field energy comes in. It's still doing gravity to the magnet because the magnet's still magnetic, so to speak. It's still moving the little bits as it's going through. But the key factor is when it leaves filtered. That is, it leaves with its all the red, the only red come out the top and only black come out the bottom. And that's the key thing is that just ends up making these monopoles of proton and electron more obvious. The magnet is essentially a duplicate of the electron-proton being stuck on top of each other. And so when the magnets are in alignment, all the forces are reflective. Therefore, there's a high amount of reflective energy here, and both with the red too. So there's a huge amount of pressure between the two items, hard to push them together. When they're reversed, the exact opposite takes place. The red energy goes out the black energy goes out the red, and there's very little pressure between the two magnets, and that's why they move towards each other. I could take this the step further and just point out that you'd have to, you see the magnet as something that's now just radiating filtered gravity. So now there's a bunch of filtered regular gravity is now filtered, red and black, and when that hits a conductor, it essentially does the same thing. It creates these magnetic domains, and it's essentially just going to end up pushing the electrons. One end of the magnet is pushing all black, so it ends up pushing electrons because it's black. That means it reflects off the electrons. The other end is red, which means the electrons will be attracted because all the force is leaving. So the electrons below the magnet will be pulled up. The electrons above the magnet will be pushed forward. And you can sort of add it up as to why that's significant, is that they get pushed. And the only way you can maintain a current is to somehow, once they're pushed, they create a pressure, a voltage, and that's it. So if there's nothing to, you have to introduce movement to keep that going, in the sense that if you reverse the magnet, you can see then you have somewhere to push them to. If you turn the magnet off, then you can see that the electrons would move back to their old position and they could be moved again. And the key thing is it's the movement of the electron where the excretion of the EMF is. So the electron can't excrete the force, the magnetism it's creating in the conductor unless the electrons are moving. And the electrons can only move if they have somewhere to move to. They can't be stuck in high pressure. The point is the magnet pushes them into high pressure. And until you relieve the pressure, they can't be pushed again. So it's just about their movement. They can't move if they're pressurized. They have to be depressurized to be repressurized again. That's the only way you can keep them moving. And you have to keep them moving to maintain the current. Alright, the flow of the force, however you want to describe that. Alright, so I got that covered. So that's really the key thing. I mean, to be able to combine the two forces, gravity and magnetism, is huge, in my opinion. A huge plus for this theory, in the sense that it creates this obvious gap filler. You don't need virtual photons anymore. They're actual photons. They're clearly just invisible energy, like all the other manifestations. Like the entire electromagnetic spectrum is invisible, right, except for a tiny percentage of it, and they're just as invisible and as mundane as those forces going right through us all the time without any notice. And the gravity is doing the same thing, the magnetism is doing the same thing, and it's clearly not irrelevant to the electrons and protons. So I did want to go to a quick explanation of the gravity and how it's sort of relevant to Einstein's equations versus Einstein's metaphors, or his explanation of a cause, bent space. So if you just eliminate the bent space part and just accept the fact that Einstein's equations are recognizing the fact that this is a time event, that when two bodies interact with each other in gravity, what Einstein is basically saying through the use of tensors and the other mechanisms is that gravity is inducive. That's why two bodies have to be in this equation, is because gravity is induced into by the two bodies in each other, and it grows with the passage of time. So you can sort of understand that if there's two bodies here, and we have this field energy as described, this pressure. And so what's happening in a gravity situation is the two bodies are randomly jiggling a little bit all the time, just from the nuances of the energy. And let's say at one moment this body, this sun, we'll call this the sun, and the other one could be the earth, moves a little bit this way. Just one extra arrow goes in this way. So it has 101 arrows have come in this way, and only 99 went in this way. So it has this little bit of extra going this way, and it absorbed it in the sense that the sun actually moved. So understand that an absorption means essentially that there's a bunch of matter inside the sun, and a bunch of it's going this way and all different ways. And what the energy that comes in this way has to do is it has to spread its energy, its one little tiny quanta, over the entire mass of the sun to move the sun a little bit. Now all you're really doing is moving the center of gravity, but let's just say technically this path could be a year. It could take a year to travel to every single material bit inside the sun if you had to actually travel there. So it's spending a lot of time. So it's turning a straight line between the sun, between the force and say the Earth over here. So if the sun wasn't in the way, the force would have got there at the speed of light, traveling this little short line. If the sun's in the way, what this force might end up doing is traveling a hugely longer distance, moving all these little bits just a little bit to move the sun a little tiny bit. So essentially this is just a trap. The force gets trapped by being absorbed. Alright, so what's happening is when gravity happens, like I said, there's this first impetus where something absorbs an arrow that would have gone here. So the idea is a force arrow comes in and it doesn't leave. That means no arrow hits here. So this body, the Earth, let's say, is getting statistically hit by one more arrow from this side, okay, which means that arrow is going to be absorbed and move this object 1/millionth or 1/trillionth of a quanta in this direction. It absorbed this arrow here because there was an imbalance. And by absorbing this arrow, now there's one less arrow going here. So now this one feels the one less arrow deficit, and it absorbs one arrow going this way, an extra arrow. So it's just a probability equation. And you can see it's just induction. This one absorbs an arrow, then this one gets one less arrow hitting it, so it moves a little bit forward. This one feels the lack of pressure, it moves a little bit forward. So what's basically happening is the mass of the Earth is essentially moving this way inside the sun at the same rate that the Earth is moving towards the sun in terms of how much matter is being moved in a direction. And so you don't see the sun moving because the Earth is very small compared to the sun's size, but the center of the sun's gravity is moving, and that explains the precession of Mercury and the precession of all the planets, frankly. And you know why Newton's math didn't account for it is because Newton's math wasn't accounting for this induction. It's an inductive force, and you know, so when the Earth finally, like say, if we stop the Earth from moving this way, then we would be giving it an absolute velocity in this direction. So if it was falling towards the sun, if it was actually allowed to fall, then it would continue to absorb more and more force in this direction. And that would be evident in the velocity increase. The velocity is just collecting more and more energy in the energy traps. And that means energy that would have hit the sun, but the Earth absorbed it and turned it into movement. So this movement's much slower than the speed of light, the movement of the big Earth, but the same amount of force is trapped inside the Earth that would have hit the sun if the Earth wasn't there. So when the Earth finally does hit the sun, all it's really doing is taking the energy it stored, that is the force it stored, the force that was going this way that it has trapped in much longer distance travels, and now it will release all that energy. And there'll be a big explosion and so forth. So as long as you're trapped, you're just converting the force. You can't really absorb it. So standing on the surface of the Earth, we can't really create gravity because we can't absorb any momentum going down. And so we just transfer it. It hits us and we transfer it into chemical pressure on the ground. So it's not that the force is exactly the same, because we've converted the force from the quantized force of gravity into the more complex magnetic force of chemical transfer. But it's still just a transfer of pressure, and the pressure is always in the form of the little bits between the electrons and the protons. Alright, so I think that's enough to defend this as a true unification theory. It meets the standards of being incredibly simple. You can't get much simpler. We only have 4 parts: electron, proton. Essentially, a neutron is just an electron and a proton stuck together, and two force elements, red ones, black ones, but they're identical in their function except for their polarization. And then we only have two interactions, the head-on collision and the perpendicular exchange. And so you can't get simpler in terms of mechanism. And with that simple mechanism, you can explain complex phenomenon like magnetism, time dilation, velocity, inertia, something that also never explained by physics. Why do things keep moving? Well, they keep moving because they've trapped energy in a direction, and they have more force trapped between their bits going this way than they have going that way. Simple explanation, simple description. And explains why the inverse square law applies, and also not only explains it, but also explains the process of induction. And so very powerful, I think, and deserves fairness, a fair opportunity to compete with the existing notions and demonstrate itself to be the much more powerful, much more consistent with the evidence, much more physical, much more detailed in a sense that the current explanations of Heisenberg, Huygens, bent space, virtual photons aren't explanations, and likewise no explanation for things like inertia. And this model gives you an illustration of how it happens. It doesn't just say it happens, it shows you how it happens, and it deserves fair review. And I think if it gets that, it has great potential when it's worked on by the scientific community. It will grow and expand exponentially. So anyway, just looking for a fair opportunity to defend this theory as the better model of our physical universe and how it functions.